In addition, a lot of what the non-separatists especially are looking for is the establishment of what Calvin called a holy commonwealth. And so that influence from Geneva is very important. The holy commonwealth would be a society that would be a mixture of government-enforced religious order and also an emphasis on religious practice. And so church and state wedded together, but enforcing true Christianity. A key part of the Puritan thinking in all of this was the notion of a covenant. We'll talk more about covenant when we talk about doctrine. But the Puritans believed that individuals made covenants or contracts with God, that the society made a covenant with God, and that individuals in societies and churches made covenants. Right? And so if you wanted to start a church, you were covenanting a church. You were making an agreement among the other people in the community. Ultimately believing that people needed to live up to these covenants. If you agree to do such and such, right, whether it's before God, whether it's to the community, whether it's to the church, you need to live up to that. And so people that did not live up to those covenants, moral offenders, were seen as threats to social order. You are disturbing society. And in Massachusetts, they often faced punishment. The Puritan government did not allow dissent. Now remember, they had left England for more freedom religiously, but they would not allow that of others. Quakers, for example. Many Quakers were hung in Massachusetts Bay because of the refusal to abide by social order. In the early years of the colony, church attendance was mandatory, and you faced civil fines or punishment if you didn't go to church. There were Sabbath laws against watching sporting events, against doing business on Sunday. The Puritans were very much committed to a literal reading of the Bible and often understood themselves as reenacting the narrative of the Bible in modern times. We talked about this on Tuesday, this notion of they saw themselves as the Israelites going through the Exodus, right? Traveling over, arriving in Canaan, the Promised Land. Not everybody fell into this notion of order. Despite the Puritans' desire to squash dissent, it was never completely eliminated. There was just too much space to spread out. You could go another place to separate yourself, start a new village. Furthermore, when they found dissenters, they often banished them across the borders of the colony, but the borders weren't protected and people could come back. The teaching could go back and forth across the border. So there were other ways in which dissent continued to develop. Additionally, there was continued pressure from England over some of the actions of the Puritans. But sometimes challenges came from within the Puritan community itself. For example, Roger Williams. Williams started out as a separatist Puritan, but eventually became a non-separatist. And then eventually became a Baptist. And ended up his life as a seeker, not the way we use it today. I'm talking about people's seeker services or something like that. Williams, a preacher, eventually comes to the idea that he doesn't like the way the government is involved in the religious life of people or the community. By forcing people to attend church, by punishing them with the government if they don't all hold the same doctrinal views, this is coercion. And Williams was against the coercion of belief. And so he was a great challenge to the authorities, condemning them for their activity. Furthermore, he believes that the Native Americans had been treated unfairly by the Puritans. Their lands taken, exploiting other things related to the Native Americans. Eventually, he is banished. Now we're talking in the middle of the 1630s. He establishes the colony of Rhode Island. And most of the dissenters from Massachusetts Bay were sent to Rhode Island. The Charter of Rhode Island is one of the few places in the English colonies that promoted religious freedom. Pennsylvania is another one. There are very few of them that actually kind of push religious freedom. And Williams even went to the step of purchasing the land for Rhode Island from Native Americans. Again, there's always that question in a lot of these colonial transactions of, do the Native Americans understand what they're agreeing to when they are involved in purchase? But here was Williams, who is challenging the government because of this issue of church and state together. Another big challenge to Puritan society, especially in the early years, was Anne Hutchinson. Hutchinson had moved to New England and to Boston in 1634. The trouble began when she started speaking about religion in her home to mixed audiences. So she would have people in her home, and they would be talking about the service, but she would kind of be the one that was leading. Why is this a problem? Well, it becomes a problem for the Puritan officials because she's acting like a preacher instead of acting like a congregant. Right? So she's taking some authority upon herself. Furthermore, they say she's acting like a husband instead of a wife. They felt that she was emphasizing grace too much and challenging the laws of society. Ultimately, Anne Hutchinson has two trials, a civil trial and a religious trial. She's found guilty of both. The transcript from especially her civil trial still exists, and you can probably find it, you can Google it, it's published and frequently in collections and other types of things. In the civil trial, it starts off with Hutchinson very much in control over her accusers. They start saying about the things that she's done, and she continues to ask them, well, why is this wrong? What have I done? Point out to me where this is wrong. And the governor of the colony is all flustered, has nothing to say. He's like, well, we know what's going on, and you know what's going on, and all this kind of thing. However, the next day, things switch because she claims that God had directly spoken to her by an immediate voice. And that's enough for her accusers, right? She's kind of condemned herself. If she had stayed on the procedures she had been the previous day, she might have come out differently. But by claiming that God had talked to her, that was enough. She was accused of consorting with the devil, and guilty of antinomianism, which essentially was a position of rejecting the law of society. She is banished to Rhode Island as, quote, a woman not fit for our society, end quote. She will die in an Indian attack in 1643. So, this Puritan view of a city on a hill faces all sorts of challenges. Right? Dissenters. It faces challenges from within, as these Puritans stand up and say, we're not doing the right kind of things. But one of the other challenges that they face as well is witchcraft. We'll talk about some of the doctrinal issues that are faced on Monday. Prevalent during this time period, and even from the earliest times of Christianity, was a belief in the supernatural world, and that it broke into this one. Right? I mean, the very beliefs of Christianity are founded on the idea of God became human, and that part of Jesus' activity was doing miracles. And so from the earliest times of Christianity, there's this belief in the supernatural. But, especially in the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, a lot of Christians often turn to magic as also a source of power and control of the world. And seamlessly in their minds combined their magic and their Christianity. And when we get into the 17th century, this was still the case. People dabbled in alchemy, astrology, divination, other types of magic, looking to the occult, especially in times where they felt that God wasn't active, feeling that the institutional church wasn't meeting the needs. This is probably very similar to what happened to the Israelites. And you think about, why did the Israelites turn to Baal or some of the other Canaanite deities? Well, those deities were devoted to fertility, particularly of crops, other agricultural land. And so they probably at some point felt Yahweh wasn't doing what they needed Yahweh to do, and so they turned to these other deities, believing that they would gain their benefits, thinking that they could hold both in tension. I mean, this is Elijah's point, right, in 1 Kings 18. How long are you going to waver between these two opinions? You can't have Yahweh and Baal together. Christians in the early modern period were doing something similar. The occult, right, magic, it crossed age lines, it crossed gender lines, it crossed class lines. There wasn't like a specific class or a specific gender that was interested in these occult processes. For these people, Christianity and magic were compatible. People used magic for healing, inscribed magical objects with Bible verses. Right? And so you might take and write out a Bible verse on a piece of paper and stick it in your shoe to kind of protect you, use it as a magic charm. And some even felt that magic would unlock secret knowledge within Christianity. And the Puritans especially, in the 17th century, lived in a world of wonders. The supernatural was very, very active in their minds. But it was active both from God and from Satan. And they believed that God and Satan used these kind of occult, hidden ways. Now the clergy, the Puritan pastors, tried to get rid of some of these beliefs, but they could not. And thinking about, okay, well, how does God use the occult? Well, for a lot of people, they understood natural disasters, signs in the sky as God giving warning, right? And so an earthquake was God's punishment. Comet was a warning that God was angry about something and something needed to change. But of course, these Puritans made a distinction between God's activity, and so referring to God's miracles, which were supernatural, and Satan's wonders, which were deceptive. They believed Satan couldn't do miracles. And so they're completely natural, they just look supernatural. But God does supernatural miracles. And so in the context of this supernaturalism is where we get witchcraft coming out. Right? And this concern with witchcraft, which has been brewing for centuries since the early modern period, the 1400s, the 1500s. Ultimately, witchcraft was seen as a threat to the social order. It turned society upside down, especially for the Puritans. But it also became an outlet for class tensions. So we're going to talk about particularly Salem here. And when you think about the Salem witch trials, and you look at the people that were accused, and the ones doing the accusing, the women that were accused in Salem were women who had inherited their husband's wealth, women that had economic independence, right? And so they're in the upper classes of society. Their accusers, the people accusing them of being witches, are servants. They're farmers' daughters. There's a daughter of a disgruntled minister. And so there's a lot of class issues that are kind of coming out in Salem as well. Additionally, especially in Salem, there seems to have been a distinction between Salem Village and Salem Town. There's Salem Village and Salem Town. And a lot of the people in Salem Village appear to have had a resentment towards Salem Town. The biggest issues of witchcraft and the witchcraft trials that are most famous extended from February of 1692 to April of 1693. Hundreds were arrested. 160 people were accused of witchcraft. 50 people actually confessed to being witches. Why would they confess to being witches? Well, they were usually spared execution when they confessed to being witch. And so that would led a lot of people to confess. 19 women were hanged. One man, who was a former minister of Salem, was tortured and killed by being pressed together between two stones. So again, a lot of the people being accused are women, but there were a few men. 5, including one infant, died in jail. The accusations began with 2 young girls who lived in the household of Samuel Parris, who was the minister in Salem Village. Parris had been hired in 1689, but by the time period we're talking about, he had a lot of problems with the village leaders, especially over his salary. In the previous 16 years before Parris had been hired, the village had gone through 3 ministers, which was pretty unheard of for the time period. Betty Parris, age 9, and Betty's cousin, Abigail Williams, age 12, started to behave erratically, have contortions, seemed to be being pinched, would sometimes just stare off into space. And their friends, too, began to have similar conditions, which did not seem to be normal childlike behavior, and so people began to be concerned. The additional girls included Elizabeth Hubbard, Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Ann Putnam, all of whom were children of the supporters of Samuel Parris. A neighbor told Parris's slave, John Indian, to make a witch's cake using some of the girls' urine to identify the witch that was tormenting them. The witch's cake would be fed to a dog, and then the dog would indicate who the witch was. Of course, it doesn't work. I don't know why. Why wouldn't that work? Tituba, who is Parris's slave, is among those that are named because she appears to be the one who knew how to make a witch's cake. And so, when it doesn't work, one of the first people questioned, assumed, is Tituba. Now, of course, there's also some race things because Tituba comes from the Caribbean, appears to have been an African slave. So, there's that suspicion of the African slave who knows about witchcraft. Ultimately, after torture, she confessed to an alliance with the devil and then starts naming other people. The girls start accusing all sorts of people as being witches, and various people are brought into court. We'll go ahead and close there and pick up with the Salem witch trials and a couple other things related to church and state on Monday.